Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video I will be addressing the current state of internal affairs which the Canadian government has now placed legislation surrounding the biblical nature of the context of placing or speaking of the Holy Bible under the context of certain contexts, which means that we are now making it illegal to speak of the Holy Bible under certain contexts, which eventually will mean that the Holy Bible will be illegal under all context, the more we pursue into this idealization. Now, in the context itself, if I may analyze this particular dissection now, in the actual context behind why the Canadian government has made the Holy Bible illegal under its certain contexts, we then see it is meant to be a legislation driven in order to prevent the minimalization of the experience of self, that which certain minorities such as the LGBT, or as we are now finding, also means something entirely different once again. And now we see the different contexts in which it affects women in their lives, in which the Holy Scripture is then placed in its context to reference, to make a point based on a moral compass of sorts, if you wish. Now, in the previous video, which I've just shared, I discover or dive into what is the self. In my own psychoanalysis of the Holy Bible, I would argue that the biblical story itself is a telling story regarding self-acceptance, which is of a paradoxical nature now in this legislation, if you wish. Because if we were to look at it from the perspective of pulling the holiest and oldest book we have of Western culture, if we are now to pull this book apart and pull it away from the core values regarding Western civilization in Canada in hopes to preach more self-acceptance to those that feel less self-accepted by others due to the fact they have yet to accept themselves within themselves, I would argue that creating an illegalization regarding a book at the center core fundamental value of its nature regarding self-acceptance, we are now creating what is known as confusion. And in this particular manner, I would argue that that legislative move is of a very poor nature, which in itself creates an act of self-harm within individuals based on the confusion that which the legislation is going to present going forward. Because if we confuse individuals in their experience of self-acceptance and we pull away the complete fundamental value away from their experience, known as the fundamental understanding of self-acceptance, aka the Holy Bible, and understanding now that if we pull away this experience, we then see the confusion lead to the deterioration resulting in the self-harm, resulting in what we now see in the idea of self-acceptance is the sadist, which in the sadist we see the idealization that in order to feel more as myself, I must harm myself, also known as cutting away perfectly healthy body tissue in order to feel more as myself in my own experience. In this particular analysis, we could argue that the fundamental value behind the idealization we are creating in the idea that we must cut you up into pieces in order for you to become more yourself, once again we see a paradox of sorts. And I would argue that the faculty of medicine that has specifically put this notion forth in my psychoanalysis of that particular faculty of medicine, I would argue that that faculty of medicine in itself has a sickness deriving from it. Rather than a practice of healing, it is actually creating the sickness, which then results back to a business model, which in the business model of sorts, if I create a problem and provide the care for the solution, I may now create money, generate wealth upon this particular business model. And in capitalism, I don't know what you folks know about capitalism, but the idea is the more I can create a demand for my product, the more I can sell, the more money I can make, the more I can then make more product to then make more money I can make. And essentially this is creating depopulation. Because we're actively seeing that we can no longer reproduce upon the transition and the idea of creating a more stable environment, which, pardon myself for not making this a statement earlier on in the video, but in the idea of self-acceptance, is the idea of self-acceptance. You are who you are. This is who you are. This is who you are. And in the idea of accepting that, you must see in your own orientation where that might have gone wrong. The idea of perceiving the psychoanalysis regarding the legislation itself, we might in itself find confused individuals in their own ideology, which in their own narcissistic tendency or of a neurotic narcissistic tendency, known as being an empathetic narcissist, which is based on the experience of, because I did not get to have that, neither will you. Or the other type of narcissist, which goes, because I experienced that, so will you. Which begs the question, if we are popularizing a business around essentially cutting healthy body tissue away from healthy body tissue in order to fix a state of the mind which in itself is invisible within the body, we can guesstimate whereabouts the mind resides, which in the head is where we have come to understand is the fundamental place of the mind. But But in the mind itself, we also see that within the brain we can experience traumas that create scars, which result in negative experience of the forward train of thought, going beyond that particular pattern that reflects into a downward cycle. And in the idea of self-acceptance, I can, sure, well done, Government of Canada. You have just created a system that does not work on itself in the Marxist ideology which you're trying to implement. And in itself, if we are not trying to actively wipe ourselves out as Canadians at this point, then I suggest you start listening as a Canadian citizen in the next couple of these statements. Regarding the societal structure at which we have generated for ourselves as Canadians, notice how if an individual of a particular license, such as a psychologist, were to place a psychoanalysis upon the societal norm or societal structure of the current societal mode or model, which is the, in essence, current day and age. Notice how if a psychologist was to base a psychoanalysis on said particular current model, that individual would then be removed of said license of being a professional psychologist, which means you were meant to shut up, which is the notion driven behind, once again, telling men to shut up if you are of a male psychologist nature. But what happens when you create a psychoanalysis and you do not fear the ideology behind losing everything because you have nothing left to lose? And so going forward, we have everything to gain as a Canadian people. The moment we can create a upward arc in our logical way of thinking, we are being led by deranged individuals, is what I'm trying to get to the meat of things, if you get what I'm saying. Thank you.